To start our conversation about adolescence, you might spend a couple of minutes thinking about the term adolescence and some of the things that it brings to mind. I think lots of times when people think of adolescence, what influences their thinking is what is known as the storm and stress view of adolescence. The idea that adolescence is a period where folks are just naturally experiencing a lot of turmoil and a lot of difficulty and a lot of ups and downs and that kind of thing. And that's sort of a popular way of portraying adolescence, and it's been around for a long time, but it turns out that many adolescents don't experience such extremes. It may be different from what it was when they were younger and that kind of thing. But when you think about what the period of adolescence involves, it kind of makes sense that there are going to be some difficulties because it's that in-between period, in between childhood and adulthood. And so the adolescent is trying to figure out, okay, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to act? Kind of leaving behind some of the ways of childhood and beginning to take on more adulthood type behavior, but they're not fully adults yet. And so it's kind of that back and forth. And then the same with the people who are around them. The people who are around them sometimes don't really know how to treat them either, because it is such an in-between time when they're beginning to take on new responsibilities, but again, not fully ready to take on full adult responsibilities yet. So in this video, we're going to do just a quick overview of some of the physical changes that occur during adolescence. Adolescence is the term that we use to refer to this period in development. And then we use another term, the term puberty, to refer to the physical changes that occur during this period of development. So when you think about the physical changes that occur in development, first of all, when does it all get started? Well, one of the things you may have recognized is that it starts a little bit earlier today than it did in the past. Years ago, several years ago, 12, 13 was typical for girls to experience menarche, or the onset of menstruation. In some cases, and especially much earlier, it was even older, say 17 or 18 years of age. But recently, we've seen more of a downward trend in all of that. So a lot of kids are beginning to experience the changes that accompany puberty quite a bit earlier. Girls as young as 9, 10 years of age are beginning to menstruate. And of course, that's not all girls. There's a whole range. Some girls will start much later, but there has been this trend, and that's what's called the secular trend in puberty. And you can take a look at figure 8.1 in your textbook that shows you some of those changes that have occurred. So you may want to take a look at that. But today, about 1 in 5 European American girls start breast development as young as age 8. So it is something that's starting quite a bit earlier than in the past. So that's a little bit on when it starts, how does it start, and what stimulates the start of puberty. Well, there are really two systems that are important in the beginnings of these changes in puberty. One of those involves the adrenal androgens, and the other is what's known as the HPG axis. To begin with, in terms of the adrenal androgens, the adrenal glands release adrenal androgens, and they start sometime around 6 to 8 years of age. And this is what eventually causes some of the physical changes that suggest maturity. Things like skin changes, changes in body hair, the development of body odor and that type of thing. And so while the androgens begin to be released at about 6 to 8, those physical changes are not obvious until a little bit later. And the changes that occur as a result of those may continue up to about age 20. So it can take a period of time depending on the individual. Now, the other system is what's known as the HPG axis. And the HPG axis begins its thing at about age 10. And again, a lot of what it stimulates is not obvious yet. It doesn't become obvious until a bit later, but this is when it starts doing its thing. And it's activity that gets started with the hypothalamus, that then proceeds to the pituitary gland, and then the gonads, so the ovaries and the testes. And of course, that's what causes the release of those estrogens and testosterone. And so here is another figure from your textbook that you can take a look at that gives you a view of what happens with this HPG axis. So you can take a look at this in your text. It's figure 8.2 in your textbook. And so what you see here is that HPG axis, the hypothalamus, the pituitary glands, and the gonads. And so the whole process starts at the hypothalamus in the brain. The hypothalamus is really important in the entire endocrine system, that system that's responsible for manufacturing and secreting different hormones. But as a result of influences from a number of different factors, things that you can see in the little bubble up here, or some of which you can see up here, the hypothalamus is stimulated to release a hormone, and that hormone stimulates the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland produces its own hormones. And those hormones then cause the ovaries in girls and the testes in boys to both grow and secrete estrogens and testosterone. And of course, it's the secretion of those hormones, the estrogens and the testosterone, that produce the physical changes of puberty. Now, it's important to note that while we often associate estrogens with women and testosterone with men, that both males and females produce estrogens and testosterone. And so things like sexual arousal are associated with testosterone, but the physical changes in men and women or in girls and boys are more closely associated with the different hormones. So those physical changes in girls are more closely associated to those changes and the release of estrogens, and the physical changes in boys are of course more closely associated with the release of testosterone. So that HPG axis is really the big driver when it comes to some of those changes with puberty. And it's that HPG axis and some of the changes that occur as a result of that, along with the adrenal androgens, that cause all of these various physical changes that people begin to experience during adolescence. So in terms of the big physical changes, there are really three big categories of physical changes or physical developments that occur during this period. There are changes in what are called the primary sexual characteristics, also secondary sexual characteristics, and then the third type of physical change is the growth spurt. So, to begin with, the primary and the secondary sex characteristics. The primary sex characteristics are those sex characteristics that are directly involved in reproduction. And so these are things that are present at birth, but they undergo further development and in some cases faster development during this period of adolescence or with puberty. So again, those are the things that are directly involved, the sexual characteristics that are directly involved in reproduction. But there are a number of sex characteristics that are not directly involved in reproduction, but that suggest or indicate sexual maturity. So those include things like the growth of facial hair and widening or broadening of the shoulders in boys, and things like the development of breasts and the widening of hips in girls. And those are examples of what we call secondary sexual characteristics. So the secondary sexual characteristics are not directly involved in reproduction, and they really develop at puberty. So during this period is when we begin to see their development. And then, of course, there is the growth spurt. And some of you are not so far away from this that you've forgotten it, I would imagine. I would imagine some of you may be able to remember some of those really rapid changes in growth. The changes in physical growth that occur during adolescence occur as rapidly or more rapidly than pretty much any time in development other than infancy and during that newborn period. So it is a period when there is very rapid change. And if you have a family member or a friend and you see them at the beginning of this stage and then you don't see them for a couple of months, when you see them again, chances are they may look very, very different because they may have experienced that growth spurt and some of these other changes. And again, the changes can occur very, very rapidly. So as those hormones flood the body, they cause these different physical changes, but they also have an impact on different regions of the brain. And so in addition to the physical changes of puberty, there are also some psychological changes or psychological things going on. So adolescents may become more emotional. They may be a little bit more sensitive, so a little bit touchy and that kind of thing. And risk-taking becomes of greater interest, and so we tend to see a bit of an increase in risk-taking in kids as a result of some of those changes in hormones as well. Now, when it comes to some of these physical changes, of course, there are different changes for boys and for girls. These are some of the things that we see taking place in girls as they develop. So things like the growth spurt, the development of breasts and pubic hair. Menarche, of course, I've used that term a couple of times today, but the term menarche basically means the onset of menstruation. So when girls begin menstruating, we say that they have experienced the onset of menarche. And then other changes, things like growth of both the uterus and the vagina, development of the vocal cords, red blood cells, and the heart. And then there are also changes in things like body fat and increased strength and those sorts of things. Now in girls, we typically see that growth spurt occurring first. So that's one of the earliest signs that we see in girls. And girls begin to experience many of these changes a little bit earlier anyway. And so You again may remember seeing girls, or you may have been one of those girls that towered over the boys for a period of time because you had your growth spurt a little bit earlier than they did. After that growth spurt, we begin to see some development, some breast development, and the growth of pubic hair. And about halfway through that process is when menarche begins, so the onset of menstruation. And then some of those other things that are listed occur typically after that. But by the time girls begin menstruating, their growth spurt is either done or almost done. So many times after girls experience menarche, they really don't grow that much. They don't get that much taller. That's one of the things, or another one of the things that we see with girls. And of course, this process can take a short period of time, or it can take a long time. And again, it's different from one individual to the next. So that highly variable rate of change, that is very normal. So again, those are some of the things that we see with girls, and sort of the order that we see some of those things. In terms of puberty for boys, these are some of the physical changes that we see in boys. So that growth spurt, not only in height, but also in muscle mass. So boys begin to be stronger. Girls experience increases in strength as well, but for boys, those increases tend to be quite a bit greater than they are for girls. Some other things that we see, and actually, some of the earliest things in boys are things like growth of the penis and the testes and pubic hair, as well as spermarchy. And spermarchy is the first sperm-laden ejaculation. And so those are some of the earliest developments we see in boys. And of course, those are not as visible. So in girls start with that growth spurt, and that's very visible. We can see that on the outside. For boys, some of these early things are not as visible. That makes it appear like there are even greater differences between boys and girls than there actually are. But while there are differences, girls begin to experience those physical changes earlier. Boys are not starting them as late as we might think that they are, because a lot of those early things are more internal, or things that we don't necessarily see, that are not obvious to other people. So it's not as different as we might think it is. And of course, for boys, that growth spurt that I mentioned a little bit earlier, that typically occurs later. And so that may be part of the reason that we think it's so different for boys and girls, because they tend to experience that growth spurt later in this whole process than girls do. So those are some of the changes that occur there. Now, another thing that happens with growth, with physical growth in puberty, is that it follows a different pattern than it did earlier in life. When we were talking about physical growth in childhood earlier in the semester, we talked about how growth in that stage of development follows both the cephalocaudal and the proxima distal sequences. So from the head down, and then from the center outwards. But in adolescence, it proceeds differently. So from bottom to top, and from outside to inside. And that's why sometimes adolescents may seem to be all arms and hands to begin with. That's because their arms and hands start to grow before their legs and their trunk do. So again, it's kind of the opposite of what we see in childhood. And some of those things are a bit more a bit more exaggerated or a bit more extreme in boys than they are in girls. And so we may really start to notice boys' feet getting really big, their hands getting really big, and it may seem unusual because it doesn't seem to fit the rest of their body, because the rest of their body, their limbs, and then the trunk have to follow in adolescence. Now, one of the things that we know and we have talked about, and you are certainly aware of, not only with adolescence, but with other stages, is that there are a lot of individual differences in terms of when children or when individuals begin to experience some of these changes. And so there are some factors, there are a number of different factors that come into play that are associated with some of those individual differences. And those factors you can see listed here, but you can also go back to figure 8.2 in your textbook, because these are many of the same things that you see listed in that little bubble at the top of that figure or that diagram. So things like genetics certainly play a role, and we do see some differences between fraternal twins and identical twins in terms of timing. Identical twins tend to be closer in timing with regards to a lot of this stuff than fraternal twins are. So that would suggest that genetics plays a role. And also, even though we've seen that trend towards younger puberty, you can see a little bit, many times you can see a bit of a correlation between a parent's age when they started experiencing some of these things and the child's age. So lots of times early maturing moms have daughters that mature a little bit earlier, and so on. So again, that's more evidence that genetics plays a role. There are also some ethnic differences with certain ethnic groups showing earlier signs of puberty and other ethnic groups showing later signs of puberty. So between different ethnic groups, there are some differences, but even within ethnic groups, of course, there are going to be differences as well. And then with things like body mass index and weight gain, those are a couple of things that also seem to be correlated with the timing of puberty. Those children who have a higher body mass index often begin to experience some of these changes a little bit earlier than kids with a lower BMI. And again, this is something that we see more often in girls. So there's a stronger correlation between those things in girls, between BMI and the onset of puberty, than what we see in boys. But there is something of a correlation in boys. And then another thing related to that, rapid weight gain during infancy. There's some evidence to suggest that a correlation between rapid weight gain during the first 9 months of life and the onset of puberty in girls. And what we see with that is many times those girls who during those first 9 months experienced very rapid weight gain, they tend to have the onset of puberty a little bit earlier. And then intense family stress is also associated with earlier onset of some of these changes with puberty. And again, this is something that seems to affect girls a little bit more than boys, but those are some of the big things. So if we were trying to predict the chances that an individual would experience some of these changes early or later, these are some of the things that we could look at. We could ask questions about the age at which parents started earlier, or at the age at which parents started experiencing some of these changes. We could also look at things like ethnic group, because again, there are certain ethnic groups that tend to start some of these changes a little bit earlier. We could also look at weight, body mass index, weight gain, and those family stressors and that sort of thing. Now, when it comes to early maturation or timing of maturation in general, is it detrimental? Is it beneficial? Which is more detrimental, early maturation or late maturation? Does it differ between girls and boys? Well, it seems that there is more of an issue with early maturation. Both boys and girls can experience problems or maybe at greater risk of different types of problems if they experience earlier maturation. And on the screen, these are some of the things that your textbook author notes that are often associated with early maturation in boys on the left and girls on the right. But while both girls and boys can be at risk of some issues as a result of early maturation, it seems that girls are at greater risk. Girls are more likely to experience problems related to early maturation. And part of the reason for that may be the fact that they start earlier anyway. So not only are they the first among the girls, but they're also the first in their peer group to begin to experience those things. And of course, that means that they may be getting attention that they're not really emotionally ready to deal with yet. And so that can lead to or has been associated with different types of problems or greater risks. When it comes to late maturation, boys may have a little bit more difficulty with that because, again, since they mature a little bit later than girls anyway, if they are late, they're the latest in the peer group. But it doesn't seem that late maturation in boys is as much of an issue as early maturation in girls is. So those are some of the physical changes, or that's just a quick overview of some of those physical changes. Another thing that we're going to look at, we'll look at things like body image and sexuality and beginning sexual behavior and that sort of thing. And so another thing that I'm going to ask you to take a look at is what's called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And so I'll be posting some information along with this video about that survey and where you can find some information about the results of that survey.